Hello, I'm Katherine Blood, curator of fine prints in the Library of Congress Prints and Photographs Division. And I'm here with Phil Sanders, who is a consummate artist, printmaker, scholar, teacher, and master printer. And he's going to talk with us about what it means to be this very special thing, a master printer. And we have a number of things selected from the library's artist print collection, and specifically from our core collection from the Robert Blackburn Printmaking Workshop, including works by Bob Blackburn and works that you helped to create and shepherd into the world yourself, working with a variety of different artists.
I started at the Robert Blackburn Printmaking Workshop in 2006, shortly after it had reopened from a brief number of years where it had been closed due to finances. So Bob Blackburn started the workshop in 1948 as a means of providing a community art space where artists from anywhere, of any religious background, any ethnicity, gender, could come and work without fear or worry of discrimination. Because at that time in New York City, as an African American printmaker, he didn't have anywhere else that he could really print. For Bob, printmaking when he was coming up was a largely recreating the world type of process. So if you think of things like your money, the New York Times, a magazine, a book, a poster, all of those are taking the world as it exists and recreating it in multiple to disseminate.
Right.
That was the ideology that predominated printmaking for centuries. So it was reproducing a painting, reproducing a watercolor or a drawing through the medium of print so that you could
commercial, practical kind of enterprise.
Very practical. I think practical is probably the prime example, because when you think of color processes, you think of CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. It's trying to get all of the colors in the world out of just 4 blending. So Bob Blackburn's approach to printmaking was radically different. He and Will Barnett spent a number of years in the early 40s to mid 40s playing with the concept of color and the concept of development of an image, using more of a painter's approach. So what I refer to is it as creating a world versus recreating the world.
Sure.
And this was the genesis of what created the printmaking renaissance, this idea that you didn't have to know what it was going to look like before you started. The idea, what we refer to as the multiple original, really comes into play in this period of time. In the sense, when someone says, well, how can it be multiple but original? The idea is that working through the process, in the case of Bob Blackburn in that period of time, lithography, it just so happened that it was editionable. So it wasn't that you needed to make an edition for the work, but it was utilizing the tools and techniques of the process because you responded to them artistically.
Right.
It just so happened that you can print more than one.
Right.
Kind of best illustrated in a print like this one, which is entitled Faux Pas in 1960. This is one of my favorite prints of Bob Blackburn's. It's a really great example of the painterly approach to printmaking.
Yeah, so painterly.
And so this is, Bob Blackburn used his own work as a teaching tool when working in collaboration with artists. And he would show different states of an image, how he was developing it, how he was allowing it to change as it went. And why I really like to use this particular print as an example is traditionally in printmaking, from a commercial standpoint, you think about color blending. And the idea is to use the smallest number of colors possible to recreate the world. But if you're painting, it's not about the smallest number of anything. It's about what it is that you want to make.
Wide open, yeah.
Which means this is layer upon layer upon layer upon layer. And so Bob had to introduce the concept of opacity. And so what you start getting is a color that overprints.
Yeah.
And you put white in the ink so that it covers versus blends. And you put white in your red so it sits on top of your orange so that it has a different feel. Versus traditional printmaking, commercial at the time, all of this would have had to blend together.
This has so much depth and
Exactly.
just beautiful
So if you're
terrain
painting,
to it.
Yeah, the terrain I think is probably the best way to describe that. Is in painting, you're working to build texture, and you can use that concept of opacity to hide something or to pull something forward, or you can go very thin, like glazing. And so Bob, with printing ink, used that to his greatest advantage to be able to push and pull things around. So covering up the blue here with a gray, allowing the white of the paper to read like a line or a drawn line. This is something that Bob is really great at as an artist, is utilizing the white of the paper as a mark in and of itself, those spaces between. So as an African American, in the early 60s and in the 50s and even in the 40s, Bob was working primarily in abstraction.
He made a leap from figurative work earlier.
Exactly. His leap was in the early 40s. Bob's approach to abstraction was similar to what was going on at the time, and he was obviously influenced by other artists who were there because he was working with a lot of other artists. And so because of the community of artists that he created, the studio of artists from the Afro-Caribbean diaspora and the larger African-American diaspora, as well as expatriated artists, Jewish artists from Europe because of the Second World War, there was a very cross-cultural mix of artists in the studio. And so many artists have commented about Bob Blackburn's period when he was alive and with his workshop, and the period of the time that I was running his workshop, about that cultural exchange being the most important thing.
Right.
Bob always used to say, if you are an artist and you meet another artist, you speak the same language. And he said, printmaking is always the place where you can see something and learn something about yourself that you would never see before. And what he means by that is, in printmaking you're working backwards. So in the case of lithography, you're drawing on a stone or a plate. And because the paper is laid onto that matrix, it passed through a printing press and then peeled off, the image is mirrored. So printmaking, like ceramics, there's very few artistic mediums where you get to be the viewer of your work just like your audience, not just the creator. Because yes, you've made these marks, but you've made marks in black, now it's going to be inked in a different color, and then it's going to be backwards. So the first time you get to see the work is just like someone else who is an audience member viewing your work. How he would take the same concept or approach that he was going for and visually experiment with it over time. It's theme and variations. Bob was very much influenced by music, especially jazz. He was very good friends with lots and lots of jazz musicians. Max Roach was a very dear friend of his. Yeah. And so this kind of idea that you can have a steady pace or rhythm within a work.
Improvisation.
Exactly. And so you can clearly see that throughout this, and this is, we're looking at a 10-year period of time about. If you look at these three prints together, what we really see is Bob working with the same kind of visual components and concept, but varying them greatly. So this black print, wood block print here, is actually the same key block that is this kind of mustard tone here. But obviously orientation has been changed again, and this has been worked out in a full color format.
Yeah.
And this print was actually done after this print.
I love seeing them together.
Exactly.
It's just, it really speaks of what he does.
And so you can see that in this period in the early 70s, he was really thinking about his woodcuts in the terms of these kind of very bright colors, some and somewhat acidic colors. And as we get a little bit later into the 70s, he was actually taking that back to early kind of graphic form, and then it leads to here.
Period here.
Exactly. Hey, it was the 70s.
I really love this. I love just the sort of formality and weight.
And it's so beautiful. And like here you can
black hole black.
Exactly, and that's kind of the printer's black ink that he really loved to use too. And here he's actually kind of mimicking wood grain. He's kind of cutting it, which then leads us to just going for the wood grain. So the work that I focused on as the director of the Robert Blackburn Printmaking Workshop, which is a program of the Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts, was really Bob's philosophy. That same level of inclusion and openness, that there's not an aesthetic of the workshop, that it's about a diversity of voices and perspectives that are able to work in collaboration as well as work with one another in a very open and communal environment. We talk about Grace Hartigan's print here. She did this at Universal Limited Art Editions in 1960 in collaboration with Bob Blackburn.
Yes.
This print is a great example of how lithography can be a sculptural drawing process. So in the case of this particular print of Grace's, all of these light gray areas here were actually this black. And she had painted on there with a very greasy material with a large brush, and then decided that value structure-wise it was too dark. And so she took a razor blade and scraped it down to lighten it. Yeah. You can do things in the print media that you can't do in others. Yeah. And whenever you're focusing on what the medium does best, you make the greatest prints. Right. So in the case for this print by Grace Hartigan, what's so beautiful about it is the way she came to the final image through that sculptural drawing process. Right. So she couldn't do that on a painting. She couldn't do that on a piece of paper. She could really only do that on a lithographic stone. This print that we did at the workshop with Glenn Baldrige is the next kind of evolution in thinking of that philosophy of Bob Blackburn's work of inclusiveness, the way things happen through collaboration. So this particular print, the artist is Glenn Baldrige. It's entitled Here Come the Miracles. It, at first glance, is this unbelievably beautiful kind of pastel color range, and the text of okay and fine. It gives you this kind of calm aspect or a serene environment that you're working in. But conceptually, for the artist,
don't get too comfortable.
Don't get too comfortable. That's right. You want to think of these as two abstracted fists, and these are like like knuckle tattoos, finger tattoos.
Right.
And this comes out of a tradition and for political dissidents and Russian gulags of tattoos as a form of protest.
Right. You mentioned international, and we're standing close to work that I love by Colombian artists from Medellin.
Yes.
Jose
Antonio Suarez Londoño is the artist, and he is very well known for his drawing practice as well as his intaglio practice. So he has this kind of process where he'll get up in the morning and he'll have his coffee and his tea and his juice and read the paper and work on a plate. And then the next day he'll go into the printmaking studio and he'll etch it and he'll print it. And if he likes it, he'll print 2 or 3. If he doesn't like it, he'll work on it. And if he can't get the print by the end of the day, it's tossed. And then, so that's like 2 days within his working week. So printmaking was a very regular practice for him. Yeah. So in contrast, when we think of Jose's work, which is kind of that old mastery feel, but is very contemporary. When you look at the print to the left here, Joseph Hart's work, he's a younger artist based in New York City, he lives in Brooklyn. It's the same techniques, intaglio with chincolle, and he's approaching it in a vastly different way.
It makes a great contrast with the Londoño.
Exactly, and so when you think about, because his really has that kind of play towards what we call modern masters, kind of that feel of, say, Miro, or even like a little kind of the remnants of, say, Jackson Pollock or de Kooning in the way in which his mark making is being done. And there's this kind of lightness as well as invitational quality. So both of these artists really liked the intimate scale as well, because it's more of a draw in, and they're actually wanting people to spend a little bit more time with the work. This print by David Ambrose, which is an etching as well. It's a combination of line etching, spit bite, drilled holes in the plate. So all the white dots are drilled holes in the plate.
Looks very much like a sort of a map and a constellation. And if you look at the back of this print, which I won't attempt to do right now, you can really see the relief from the perforation.
Exactly. So what the idea is, the artist, he would pierce paper a lot. And so he kind of wanted to have a similar feel to that. But in this case, because you're piercing the plate, not the paper, that means you get the raised dot, which in a sense is kind of like Braille. So your analogy of a map is he really wanted the print to have that sort of tactile quality, almost a way of finding your way around. Does that make sense? And
yeah,
it's based off of Charlemagne's chapel, the composition.
Right.
So this print by Chikaya Booker is a combination of woodcuts printed on different papers that are then chincolled together, and which is different than collage, and I'll be very specific about making that distinction.
I was at your studio while you were working on this one, and I have images of the process with all the push.
Exactly. So what we would do for Chikaya Booker is she would carve wood blocks. We would print those in black ink or white ink on different papers.
And here's Willie Birch's lithograph,
which I think is a great example of 2 things that were happening at the Robert Blackburn Printmaking Workshop. These are 2 views split from his backyard. And Willie had left New York City to move back to New Orleans. He said specifically to explore drawing. And he said there is a spirit of New Orleans within drawing that I don't believe has really been explored. And he said, so I needed to move home to really fully explore that. We talked about building the image as he goes. So he had 2 photographs he was working from as guides, but they're 2 small 4x6 photographs. And so he started drawing, and we started building it, first layer, second layer, printing very transparent black inks. So it's wash work and crayon drawing and pencil drawing. It's all building and building and building. So he draws each layer in black. We printed a different quality of black ink.
It's a very colorful black and white image.
Exactly. So we're using like green blacks and blue blacks and orange blacks and a little bit of yellow in a black or a little bit of silver in a black. It ends up being a 10-layer, 10-color lithograph.
Right.
And so for him, he got to explore his drawing method through a wildly different medium. And in transitioning from this print to this suite of lithographs by Sarah Sanders, this was a print-as-you-go process, meaning you draw a layer, respond to it, draw the next layer, it gets printed in another color, and you respond. The works that you see here of Sarah Sanders are done in the same format.
These are mind-bending, these works. They're tiny, but they're monumental.
They're beautiful. Yeah. And so Sarah's focus as an artist is to really positively influence your life. And so for her, chairs are kind of a stand-in for almost for people in a lot of ways. So she
they're
considers
like
portraits.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So, and when you think about the way in which the aesthetics of them, you take certain things for granted when you look at them, like the fact that there is only 2 legs instead of 4 that are visible, the fact that they feel cozy and inviting. So she doesn't really she wants you to feel like you can sit in the chair. And it's that kind of sitting in a chair that allows you to relax and shed the weight of the day.
The last thing you've hinted at this, but I want to sort of mention that all of this is freely accessible. This is a public collection. It belongs to everybody. It belongs to you and Congress and everyone in the world, really. So we hope that you'll help inspire people to come and explore and study and there's an endless frontier in the collections.
My God, yes. And I really encourage people to do the same. Why the Printmaking Workshop archive, as well as contemporary prints being produced today, we wanted it to come here, was because it's open and accessible. Yeah. Because to Bob, artwork is meant to be lived with. It's meant to be in the world. It's not art if it's not out in the world. Right. But you guys here are so rare in the sense that it's fully accessible. Anyone can come and experience the work.
And these are here in the context that we're sort of preserving them. They're primary sources. This is DNA for research and study.
And there's no distance between you and the work.
That's right.
And it's you get to experience it and you get to understand it, and you can talk to trained professionals about the work, which is also extraordinarily rare. Because normally, if the work was being displayed in a museum, it's on a wall and you maybe get a couple of sentences about something. But to be able to have someone to talk to give you context, to really help you understand some of the history of why this thing came to be, really helps, I think, allow art to become part of someone's life rather than it being something that is at distance.
Right.